600 people, dazzling lights, and a woman stands in the middle of the crowd with a microphone in her hand, declaring to the entire upper class that she has stolen someone else's husband, then smiling triumphantly. But the wife doesn't cry, doesn't break down, doesn't say a word. She stands there, frighteningly calm, because she's known it all along, and she's prepared. If you're watching this story, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has come. Don't leave, because this is just the beginning. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, cream-colored cardstock embossed with gold lettering, the kind of thing that got framed in certain households. Evelyn Ashford had set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time without touching it. The Harrington Foundation Annual Gala. 600 guests. Black tie. The sort of evening where deals got sealed over glasses of wine that cost more than most people's rent, where reputations were cemented or quietly dismantled between courses. Nathan had said they had to go. He'd said it the way he said most things lately. Not as a question, barely as a statement, more like an announcement delivered to a room he expected to stay empty. She'd said fine. That was 6 weeks ago. A lot had happened in 6 weeks. Evelyn stood now in the bathroom of the Harrington Grand Ballroom's private suite, the one reserved for foundation board members and their spouses, and she looked at herself in the mirror the way she hadn't looked at herself in years. Not checking, not fixing, just looking. She was 41 years old. She had spent the last 14 of those years building a life that looked, from the outside, like everything a person could want. A husband who moved through rooms with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no. A home in the Meridian district that featured in architectural magazines. A marriage that their social circle described as aspirational without anyone asking Evelyn what she thought about that particular word. She picked up her earring from the marble counter and put it on. Then the second one. Her hands were steady. That surprised her still, even now. She'd expected her hands to shake. They didn't. She'd cried exactly twice since she found out. The first time was in the parking garage of her lawyer's office building, alone in the car, 3 months ago, after she'd signed the initial paperwork that began the quiet process of restructuring her assets back under her family's trust. She'd gripped the steering wheel and let it happen. Ugly, airless, the kind of crying that leaves your face swollen and your chest bruised. She'd allowed herself 40 minutes. Then she'd driven home, showered, reapplied her makeup, and started dinner because Nathan had texted that he'd be home by 7. He hadn't been. He'd arrived at 9:15 smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. The second time she cried was the night she read the messages. That had been earlier, 4 months back, when she'd found his phone unlocked on the nightstand while he slept. She hadn't been looking. She hadn't been suspicious, or not fully, not yet. There had been a kind of low-grade unease living in her chest for months that she had been actively, consciously talking herself out of. She'd reached for his phone intending to check the time because her own was charging across the room, and the screen had already been opened to a thread. 37 messages in a single evening. She had stood there in the half-dark reading them, and the sound that came out of her was something she hadn't recognized as her own voice. But she had stopped crying before he woke up. She didn't cry a third time. She decided, standing in that bedroom in the dark with her husband asleep 3 feet away, that she was finished with a particular kind of grief. That what she did next would not be driven by hurt. That hurt, she understood suddenly and with total clarity, was a luxury she could not afford right now. So she'd gone to work. Evelyn smoothed the front of her gown, deep navy, structured at the shoulder, nothing flashy, the kind of dress her mother had always described as speaking before you open your mouth. And she walked back out into the suite. Nathan was at the wet bar pouring 2 fingers of scotch, already his second since they'd arrived. He was wearing the charcoal suit she'd helped him pick out 18 months ago, back when she was still the kind of wife who cared what her husband wore to events. He was 44 and still striking in a way that had always worked in his favor. Broad across the shoulders, jaw clean shaven, hair touched now at the temples with gray that made him look authoritative rather than old. He had a face built for confidence. Evelyn had once loved that about him. "You ready?" he said without turning around. "Yes." He turned then and looked at her, the way he had been looking at her lately, which was briefly and without full attention, The way you check a clock rather than actually read it. You look fine. She held his gaze. Thank you, Nathan. Something crossed his face. A flicker of something she might have once tried to interpret. He looked away first. They rode the elevator down to the ballroom level without speaking. The doors opened and the noise hit them both. The low roar of 600 people in a space designed to make everyone feel important. Crystal and candlelight, and the sound of a string quartet playing something that no one was actually listening to. A man in a tuxedo appeared immediately to hand them their table cards and escort them into the room, and Nathan straightened almost involuntarily as they stepped through the doors, his whole posture shifting, his chin lifting a degree, the face he wore in public settling over his actual face like a mask being applied. Evelyn had watched him do it for 14 years. She knew exactly which Nathan she was standing next to right now. Their table was position 7, near the center of the room, next to the Whitmore Vance Group and across from the Stellarfield Capital Partners. Good placement. Nathan had made sure of it, had spent 3 phone calls over the past month maneuvering their seating because table position at the Harrington Gala was a form of communication in itself, and Nathan Cole understood that language fluently. He pulled out her chair without thinking about it, muscle memory from a version of their marriage that no longer existed, and she sat. He sat beside her, and within 45 seconds was already leaning toward the man on his left in conversation, his scotch glass in hand, his laugh arriving right on cue. Evelyn looked at the table arrangement and began to orient herself. She had been to this gala 4 times before. She knew roughly 230 of the people in this room by name, another 100 by face. She knew which marriages in this ballroom were actually partnerships and which were arrangements, which executives at which tables had taken calls from her father's office in the last 90 days, which board members had quietly adjusted their positions based on a conversation held in her family's dining room without Nathan's knowledge. Her family. The Ashford name was not loud. It had never needed to be. Evelyn's father, Graham Ashford, had built the kind of wealth that didn't require announcement. It was simply there, present in the room the way weather is present, the kind of thing you feel before you see evidence of it. Graham Ashford sat on the boards of 3 of the city's largest institutional funds. Her brother Daniel was a senior partner at Ashford Crane, the family's investment advisory firm. Her mother, Constance, had for 30 years quietly shaped philanthropic giving across the region in ways that looked like charity and functioned like architecture, placing people, building alliances, removing obstacles before they became visible. Nathan Cole had been a very good opportunity 14 years ago. A smart man. Hungry. Building something real at Vantage Group. Evelyn had believed in what he was building. She had introduced him, over the course of their marriage, to every resource the Ashford network could provide, had opened doors he hadn't known existed, had made phone calls on his behalf that he never knew she made, had quietly ensured that when certain contracts came up for decision, the names of people who trusted the Ashfords were at the table. She had never told him any of this, not because she was secretive, because it hadn't occurred to her that it would ever matter. It had been love. It had been partnership. She had invested in him the way you invest in something you believe in, not as a transaction, but as a commitment. She had not been keeping score. She was keeping score now. A waiter appeared and poured her wine without being asked. She thanked him by name. She'd made a point over the past 6 weeks of learning the names of the Harrington's banquet staff. And he looked briefly startled and then genuinely pleased. Nathan didn't notice. He was 3 deep in conversation now, leaning forward, that particular energy he carried when he was performing competence for an audience he wanted to impress. The man across from him was Douglas Fenwick, a senior partner at Stellarfield, and Nathan was explaining something with his hands in the air, gesturing in that expansive way that meant he believed he was the most interesting person at the table. Douglas Fenwick was smiling but watching Nathan's eyes in the flat, measuring way that experienced investors always watch the eyes of the people who wanted their money. Evelyn sipped her wine and watched Douglas Fenwick's face. She thought, he doesn't trust you as much as you think he does. She had suspected this for 2 months. 3 weeks ago, she'd confirmed it in a conversation with Douglas's wife Eleanor over coffee at the Castellan Club, where Evelyn had been a member for 12 years. Eleanor Fenwick had not said anything explicit. She had said enough. The evening moved. This way these evenings moved, cocktail hour bleeding into dinner, conversation layering over conversation, the room growing warmer as more bodies pressed into it. The string quartet replaced by a pianist who played tasteful background music with the resigned competence of someone well paid not to be noticed. Evelyn ate. She spoke to the people she was supposed to speak to. She was pleasant and warm and specific in the way that made people feel genuinely seen, and every interaction she had that evening was also, underneath, information she was adding to a picture she'd been assembling for 4 months. She saw Sienna Vale at 40 minutes into dinner. She had known Sienna would be here. Of course she had. Sienna was an executive director at the Meridian Cultural Foundation, one of the Harrington Gala's primary partner organizations. She would not have been able to avoid this evening without raising questions she clearly had no interest in raising. Sienna Vale was 34, slim, precise in her movements, with the kind of beauty that required constant maintenance and clearly received it. She wore a red dress that announced its own arrival, and she moved through the room with the particular energy of someone convinced that every eye was on her. Some of them were. She had dark hair worn up and sharp cheekbones, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but worked efficiently in its absence of depth. Evelyn watched her cross the room toward the bar and felt nothing that surprised her. The absence of surprise was something she had been cultivating carefully. Surprise was a kind of vulnerability. She had spent 4 months extracting herself from the capacity to be surprised by anything that had to do with Nathan and Sienna. What she did notice, and file, precise and deliberate, was that Sienna did not look at Nathan when she entered the room. She very specifically did not look at him in the way that required active effort. The deliberateness of the not looking was itself a form of looking. Nathan's posture changed when Sienna entered the room. Barely. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Evelyn knew his body the way you know the body of someone you have slept beside for 14 years, and she caught it immediately. The infinitesimal shift in his shoulders, the quality of attention that went out of him and then came back slightly rearranged. She picked up her fork and continued eating her salmon. The program began at 9 o'clock. Foundation board chair, a compact woman named Harriet Bloom, opened with remarks about the year's philanthropic achievements, the kind of remarks designed to make everyone in the room feel good about their wealth while also loosening it. There were 2 video presentations and a live testimonial from the Youth Arts Initiative that the Harrington Foundation had funded for the past 3 years. Evelyn had helped architect that particular grant 18 months ago through a connection she'd leveraged via her mother. She had not mentioned this to Nathan. It hadn't seemed relevant. At 9:47, Harriet Bloom announced that the stage was open for remarks from the evening's key supporters, and several people stood and spoke briefly, toasting the foundation, the city, the shared project of building something better. Standard. The pianist returned during a brief interlude. Waiters moved through with dessert. And then Sienna Vale stood up. It was not scheduled. Evelyn could see Harriet Bloom's expression shift slightly. A professional recalibration, the practiced smile of someone deciding in real time how to manage an unscripted moment. Sienna had simply risen from her table and lifted a champagne glass, and the room, as rooms do, began to quiet because a standing figure with a raised glass demands a kind of gravity. "I want to say something," Sienna said, her voice carrying easily. She knew how to project, had clearly practiced this, had not left it to chance. Tonight feels like the right moment. The room was quiet. 600 people. The pianist had stopped playing. The waiters had paused. Evelyn set down her fork. 14 months ago, Sienna said, I was at a crossroads in my life, personally, professionally, and someone, a remarkable man, helped me find my way through that. She paused. Her eyes moved across the room and found Nathan Cole's face. The pause was calculated. It was the pause of someone who had rehearsed. Nathan, his name in her mouth, in front of everyone, landing in the room with a weight she had designed carefully. What we've built together, what we're building. I'm not willing to pretend anymore that it belongs in the shadows. The room understood. Rooms always understand before anyone says the explicit word. 600 people processed the sentence in the space of 2 seconds, and the sound that filled the ballroom was the particular silence that follows a detonation. the held breath before anyone decides what to respond with. Evelyn felt the attention of the room beginning to drift toward her. She was, after all, Nathan Cole's wife. She was sitting 3 feet from Nathan Cole. She was the subject of the most spectacular public moment this gala had produced in 10 years of annual events. She picked up her wine glass. She took a measured sip. She set it down. She did not look at Nathan. She looked at Sienna. Sienna was looking back at her now. There was something in Sienna's expression that Evelyn could read clearly. It was triumph, yes, but it was also something else, something that lived underneath the triumph and was doing more structural work. It was an expectation. Sienna was waiting for Evelyn to react, to stand, to cry, to shout, to collapse in some visible, satisfying way that would complete the scene Sienna had spent weeks or months imagining. Evelyn held Sienna's gaze. She smiled. Not a cold smile, not a performance, just a smile. Small and genuine and containing absolutely nothing that Sienna had prepared herself to receive. And then she looked away. She looked toward the ballroom's main entrance, the tall double doors at the rear of the room, currently closed. She looked at them in the calm, expectant way you look at a door you know is about to open, and she reached into her clutch, where her phone sat face down, and sent a single text message. 3 words. It's time. Come. Nathan had finally turned toward her. She felt it before she saw it, felt the heat of his panic beginning to rise. And he said her name in a low, urgent voice. Evelyn. The voice of a man realizing the ground had changed under his feet without anyone telling him. She turned and looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. It was the face of a man who had been so certain about the terms of a situation that the possibility of different terms had never fully been considered. He was calculating. He was trying to find the path back to control. Evelyn, I can... You don't need to, she said. Her voice was even. Not cold, simply even, the way a surface is even when it's been deliberately prepared. Sit down, Nathan. At the far end of the ballroom, the tall double doors opened. Graham Ashford walked in first. He was 67 years old, and he walked into rooms the way tectonic plates move. Not fast, not dramatic, but with the absolute certainty of something that reshapes the ground it crosses. Behind him came Daniel, Evelyn's brother, and beside Daniel was Constance Ashford in a steel-gray gown, and behind them came 3 other men whose names, if you knew this city's financial architecture at all, would have rearranged your understanding of what this evening was. The room recognized them. Recognition moved through 600 people like weather moving through a field. Silent, immediate, total. Sienna Vale was still standing, still holding her champagne glass, still waiting for Evelyn Ashford to break. She had no idea that the night she had chosen, this room, this crowd, this very moment, was the night Evelyn had been building toward since the moment she'd stood in a dark bedroom 4 months ago and decided to stop crying. The music didn't start again. Nobody moved toward dessert. Graham Ashford looked at his daughter across the ballroom, and Evelyn looked back at her father, and something passed between them that required no translation. He gave her the smallest nod. She turned back to the room, back to Sienna, back to Nathan, who had gone very still in his chair, and whose face had taken on the particular ashen quality of a man watching something irreversible begin. Evelyn had not planned for anger. She had planned for this instead. This quiet, this stillness, this moment where the room understood everything and she had not needed to say a single word. She lifted her own champagne glass from the table. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply held it and waited. And the room waited with her, and the silence stretched out like something pulled taut. And in that silence, in the suspended collective breath of 600 witnesses, the shape of what was actually happening here began, finally, to become visible to everyone who had not yet seen it coming, including the man sitting next to her who had spent the last 14 months believing he was the one who held all the cards. The Ashford family moved through the ballroom the way cold air moves through an open window. You felt it before you saw the source of it, a drop in temperature that made the skin on the back of your neck register something your brain was still catching up to. Graham Ashford did not hurry. He had never hurried in his life. and the studied patience of his pace across the marble floor was itself a form of communication directed at everyone watching, which was everyone in the room. Nathan Cole was watching. His scotch glass was on the table in front of him, and he had not touched it in 4 minutes, and his hand was resting beside it with the rigid, effortful stillness of a man actively preventing himself from making a visible error. He was breathing through his nose in a careful, measured rhythm that Evelyn recognized as the thing he did when he was genuinely afraid and trying to look like he wasn't. She had seen it twice before, once during the Vantage Group refinancing crisis 3 years ago, once the night his father called with the news about his brother. She knew the rhythm. She knew what it meant. She kept her eyes on the room. Sienna Vale had lowered her champagne glass by now, but had not sat down, which was its own kind of problem. She was standing in front of 600 people who were no longer looking at her with the attention she'd expected, who were looking instead at the doors, at the Ashfords, at the complicated geometry of something none of them had been invited to witness. The expression on Sienna's face had traveled from triumph through confusion and was now residing in a territory that had no clean name, something adjacent to the feeling you get when you step onto ice you were certain was solid and feel it flex beneath your foot. She sat down. Graham Ashford reached table 7. He looked at his daughter, and the look was brief and total, and he bent and kissed her cheek once, unhurried. The gesture of a man who has all the time in the world because he has already decided how the evening ends. Then he straightened and looked at Nathan Cole for approximately 3 seconds. Nathan said, "Graham." His voice came out wrong, not weak exactly, but narrowed, compressed, like a signal running through damaged wire. Graham said nothing. He straightened his jacket and turned toward the seat Constance had already been guided to at the adjacent table, which had been quietly reorganized in the last 20 minutes by 3 members of the Harrington's event staff who had received a request from the Foundation's largest single donor, Ashford Crane's charitable arm, which had underwritten this gala for the last 6 consecutive years. Nathan turned to Evelyn. "You planned this." She looked at him. "I did." "The seating." "All of it." She said it simply, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, as a fact delivered to someone who needed to have it. He stared at her for a long moment, and she let him stare and didn't move or offer him anything to grab onto. His jaw was tight. The muscle at the hinge of it was working, that involuntary thing his body did when he was trying to control what his face showed. He said, very quietly, "How long?" "Does it matter?" "Evelyn, how long have you—" "Nathan." She picked up her wine glass, and the action was so calm and so deliberate that it stopped him mid-sentence the way a raised hand stops traffic. "We're at a table with 14 people, and every one of them is watching us right now while trying to appear as though they aren't. Whatever you want to say to me, you can say it later." He looked at the table. She was right, and he knew it, and the knowledge that she was right sat on his face in a way he couldn't fully disguise. He reached for his scotch. His hand was not entirely steady. He took a drink and set the glass down and turned back toward Douglas Fenwick, who had the grace to resume their earlier conversation as though nothing had interrupted it, though Evelyn caught the flicker of calculation behind Douglas's eyes when he looked at Nathan, the look of a man rapidly revising a set of numbers. Daniel Ashford appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. He was 38, lean and deliberate in the way of men who have learned to be careful with their energy, and he bent down to speak close to her ear. "The Parrish group saw them come in," he said. "Callum Parrish already texted Dad." "I know," Evelyn said. Fenwick's junior partner left the table. "Where did he go?" "Bar. His phone was in his hand before he was out of his chair." She nodded. She had expected this. The movement of information at these events was faster than most people understood. The room had its own circulatory system, gossip and signal, and implication moving through it in currents that looked like social chatter but functioned as intelligence. Within the next 20 minutes, the meaning of the Ashford family's arrival would have been decoded, transmitted, and received by every person in this ballroom who had a financial relationship with Nathan Cole or with Vantage Group, which was, by her last count, 43 people. "Has anyone approached Dad yet?" "Whitmore. About 4 minutes after they walked in." "What did he say?" Daniel's expression did not change. "That he was looking forward to breakfast next week." Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second only. Then she opened them and said, "Good." Across the room, Sienna Vale was speaking to the woman beside her in what looked like casual conversation, but had the tight, airless quality of a person speaking in order to give her hands and mouth something to do while her mind worked somewhere else entirely. She had glanced toward the Ashford table 3 times in the last 5 minutes. Evelyn had counted. The formal program concluded at 10:15. Harriet Bloom closed with remarks designed to transition the room from program to reception, the kind of language that told 600 people the serious part was over and the drinking could begin in earnest. The string quartet returned. The floor opened. People began to move. Nathan stood immediately. He touched Evelyn's arm, not gently, not roughly, just the touch of a man who needed her in a specific location and was communicating this through physical contact because he'd run out of better options. "Come with me." She looked at his hand on her arm. He removed it. "Please," he said. The word came out stripped of everything, just the bare request, and she heard in it the exact register of a man who was beginning to understand the dimensions of what he was standing in. She stood. She followed him because she had decided before this evening began that there would be a conversation with Nathan, that she would not deny him that, because she was not doing this out of cruelty and she wanted him to understand, clearly, the difference. He found a service corridor off the main hall, the kind of door that looks like a wall panel until you know where the handle is, and she followed him through it into the fluorescent quiet of a space that smelled like clean linen and industrial floor cleaner. A single long corridor. A rolling cart of folded tablecloths stacked at one end. He turned on her before she'd fully cleared the door. "How long?" he said again, and this time there was nothing managed about his voice. 4 months, she said. "Since March." He put his hand through his hair. The gesture cracked something open in her that she had not expected. Not grief exactly, not love exactly, something older and more structural than either. She pressed it down. She watched him pace 2 steps and come back. "The assets," he said. "The Ashford Crane accounts that were listed under the restructured," she said. "In February, before I found out. My family's legal team completed it in early March. You weren't named in that process." He stopped moving. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the accounts that you believed were joint assets were always held in Ashford family trust structures. The documentation that showed them as joint was administrative, a convenience. My family's attorneys reviewed everything in February, and it turns out the convenience was never legally binding." The color left his face in a way she watched happen, the way you watch weather change. "That's not—" He stopped. He was running the numbers in his head. She could see it, the specific quality of silence that came over him when he was calculating. "Evelyn?" "The Vantage Series D. The institutional commitments. Those were built on the Ashford relationships." "They were," she said. "Yes. If your family withdraws—" "They're not withdrawing anything tonight," she said. "Nothing changes tonight. My father didn't come here to make a move. He came because I asked him to, and because this is his daughter's life, and because the people in that room needed to see, without any words being exchanged, that the Ashford family knows exactly where it stands." Nathan stared at her. Something was shifting behind his eyes. She could see the moment when the first version of what he'd understood about this evening gave way to a second, more accurate version. "You didn't come here to fight," he said. "No. You came here to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "To make sure everyone understood the context," Evelyn said. "That's all. The rest of it happens in offices, not ballrooms." He sat down on the edge of the linen cart. It was such a small, defeated gesture. This man who filled rooms with his certainty, folding himself onto the edge of a cart of hotel tablecloths in a service corridor, that she had to look away for a moment. She looked at the far wall. She breathed. "I loved you," he said. It came out blunt, not theatrical, which made it worse somehow. "I want you to know that. Whatever you think." "I know you did," she said. "That's not the question." "Then what is?" "The question is what you chose to do while you loved me." She turned back and looked at him directly. "And the question of whether you thought that the way our life worked, the access, the relationships, the names that opened certain doors, whether you thought any of that was separate from me, whether you thought you could keep the infrastructure and remove the person it came from." He didn't say anything. "Because I think you did think that," she said. "I think somewhere along the way you started to believe that you had built what you built on your own. I think you started to edit the story, and I think Sienna Vale was very good at helping you tell the version of the story where you were the one who deserved more. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. You humiliated me in front of 600 people tonight, Nathan. You've been lying to me for 14 months. I'm not here to be fair. The silence in the corridor was of a particular quality, sealed, pressurized. What do you want? He said. I want a divorce. I've wanted it since March. My attorney has been in contact with your attorney's office, though I suspect your attorney hasn't been particularly forthcoming with you about the specifics of what those conversations have covered. Something moved across his face. Jeffrey Marsh has been your attorney for 9 years. He was introduced to you through my father's firm. He is a careful man who reads situations carefully. She let that land. I'm not telling you that as a threat. I'm telling you so that when you walk out of this corridor tonight, you have an accurate picture of what you're walking into. He was on his feet again, not toward her. He wasn't that kind of man, had never been, but upright. The way a person who needs to be standing gets upright because being seated feels like exposure. You're telling me I have nothing. I'm telling you that what you have, you built with support that you're no longer going to have. That's not the same as nothing. You're a talented man. You know this industry. You know how to build things. You did build things. I'm not taking that from you. She picked a piece of invisible lint from her sleeve, more for something to do with her hands than because it was there. But you're going to need to build the next chapter without the scaffolding, and you're going to need to do it without me. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. Sienna, he started, is not my concern. I need you to know it wasn't Nathan. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. I genuinely do not want to hear about Sienna tonight. Not in here, not anywhere. Whatever that is, it belongs to you. Handle it. She moved toward the door. Evelyn. She stopped but didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said. And it was the genuine version, not the version people performed in order to get something, but the version that costs something to produce, the one that comes out abraded and too late and hollow in the way of all the things that matter more after they're lost than they did while they were present. She stood with her hand on the door. She thought about 14 years. She thought about the morning 6 years ago when he'd driven her to the hospital at 2 a.m. because she was sure something was wrong, and the way he'd held her hand in the waiting room with his thumb moving back and forth across her knuckles without him being aware he was doing it. She thought about the version of him that had existed before the version she was currently standing in a corridor with. She said, I know. And she opened the door and went back into the light. The ballroom was different now. The room had metabolized the evening's events and was operating on a different chemical compound. The conversations were quieter, closer, the body language tighter, people oriented toward each other in the clustered, urgent way of a crowd, processing information it can't fully discuss in public. She moved through it without stopping, exchanging brief words with two people who called her name, deflecting without being cold, navigating with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 20 years in rooms exactly like this one. She found her mother near the south windows, standing with Harriet Bloom and a woman Evelyn recognized as the head of the parish endowment, and the three of them were conducting what looked like a pleasant general conversation and was almost certainly not. Constance Ashford took one look at her daughter's face and excused herself with the seamless grace that characterized everything Constance did, and she took Evelyn's arm and walked with her toward the window alcove that looked out over the city, 31 floors below. How is he? Her mother said. Scared, Evelyn said. Angry, still trying to find the angle. Constance nodded. She was 64 and wore her age like someone who had made peace with time without surrendering to it, and she looked out the window for a moment before she spoke. Sienna Vale spoke to your father 20 minutes ago. Evelyn turned. At the gala. At the bar. She apparently approached him directly. Constance's voice was neutral, which meant it was controlled. She told him that Nathan was committed to repairing things, that she thought a conversation between families might be productive. The sheer miscalculation of it was almost staggering. Evelyn stared at her mother. She approached Dad. She did. What did he say? Constance looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who had spent 4 decades watching men and women make exactly the wrong move at exactly the wrong time and had long since stopped being surprised by the variety of ways human beings could misread a room. He told her he hoped she was enjoying the evening. Evelyn turned back to the window. Below, the city moved in its usual way, cars and light, and the anonymous industry of 100,000 people going about lives that had nothing to do with this ballroom or this evening, or any of the things that felt, up here, like the only things in the world. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple and breathed. She has no idea, Evelyn said. Not quite a question. She believed tonight was a victory, Constance said. She may still believe it. These things take time to metabolize. When they figure it out, when he figures it out, Constance corrected gently. She'll figure it out when he does. Her position is entirely derivative of his. That was the thing, Evelyn thought. That was the architecture that Sienna had either not seen or had chosen not to examine. Whatever Sienna Vale had been building, whatever version of a future she'd been constructing in her own mind over 14 months, she had built it entirely on the assumption that Nathan Cole's power was Nathan Cole's, that it was structural, self-generated, that it would still be there when everything else shifted. She didn't know about the calls Graham Ashford had made in March, April, and May. She didn't know that Douglas Fenwick's fund had been quietly reevaluating its Series D position for 6 weeks. She didn't know that 3 of Vantage Group's board members had attended a breakfast at Ashford Crane headquarters in April for reasons that had been described in the calendar invitation as a routine quarterly review and were not that. She didn't know that everything Nathan Cole had been so certain he owned had, in fact, other people's fingerprints on its foundation. She was about to. Constance touched Evelyn's hand briefly. Come. Your father wants a moment with you before we leave. Evelyn straightened. She adjusted the strap of her clutch. She turned away from the window and the city below it, and the particular vertigo of looking down at everything that existed below the level of a life she had spent a year quietly taking apart in order to rebuild it correctly. She walked back into the ballroom, and across the room, at the bar, she saw Sienna Vale watching her. Sienna's expression had changed again. The triumph was gone entirely now, replaced by something that was working very hard to look like composure and was not quite achieving it. There was a question in Sienna's eyes, and the question was not directed at anyone in particular. It was directed at the room, at the evening, at the way things had felt 2 hours ago versus the way they felt now, at the slowly accumulating sense that something had happened here that she hadn't scripted and couldn't fully read. Evelyn met her eyes, held them, long enough to be intentional. Then she looked away and crossed the room to her father. She did not see the moment when Sienna Vale took out her phone and called Nathan Cole, but she knew it was happening, had known it would happen before the night was over, had known that the 2 of them would end this evening in a room somewhere trying to reconstruct the shape of what they'd walked into and whether it was as serious as it felt or whether the feeling would pass by morning. It would not pass by morning. What none of them knew yet, what Nathan's attorney was in the process of discovering in the documents Evelyn's legal team had filed that afternoon, time-stamped 4:47 p.m., 2 hours before the Gala's cocktail hour, was that Evelyn had already moved. Not tonight, not in the ballroom with an audience of 600, not with a speech or a confrontation or any of the dramatic machinery of public revenge. She had moved quietly, the way her father moved, the way the Ashford family had always moved, ahead of the moment, below the surface, with patience that looked like stillness and was anything but. By morning, Vantage Group's primary credit facility would have received a notification from the Ashford Crane Legal Division that constituted under the terms of a clause buried in the original facility agreement signed 11 years ago, a formal declaration of material change in the personal guarantor structure of the underlying. Her father took her hand when she reached him and held it briefly, his grip dry and warm and certain, and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since she was a child, like she was something he had built with great care and was not surprised to see standing upright. "You did well tonight," he said. She shook her head. "Tonight was nothing," she said. "Tonight was just the part they'll remember." He studied her face. Something moved in his eyes. Not quite pride, something more complicated and more careful than pride. He said, "The filing." "This afternoon," He nodded slowly. Nathan's going to call me. I know. What do you want me to say to him? She thought about the service corridor, about 14 years, about his hand not quite steady on his Scotch glass, about the word sorry arriving too late and meaning too much and not enough simultaneously. Tell him, she said, that you hope he's enjoying the evening. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time tonight, he smiled. And across the ballroom, unaware that the documents had already been filed, unaware that the credit facility notification was already in transit, unaware that the morning would bring a phone call from his own attorney using words like material breach and personal guarantor and acceleration clause. Nathan Cole was walking back through the ballroom doors with his phone pressed to his ear, his face assembled into its public shape, moving through 600 people who were already, quietly, reevaluating what they thought they knew about him. He walked like a man who still believed he understood the game. He did not yet know that the game had ended 4 months ago, and that everything that came next was simply... The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Nathan had been awake since 4. He knew this because he had watched the ceiling of the hotel suite. He had not gone home, had not been able to face the specific architecture of the house with its specific silences, turned from black to gray to the particular flat white of early morning filtering through curtains that cost more than he'd spent on his first car. He had lain in the center of the king bed in his suit trousers and unbuttoned shirt and stared at nothing and listened to the sound of his own breathing and tried methodically to reconstruct the sequence of the previous evening in a way that produced a different conclusion than the one he kept arriving at. He could not produce a different conclusion. His phone was on the nightstand. It had been ringing intermittently since midnight. Sienna, 3 times. A number he didn't recognize twice, his assistant Marcus once at 11:58 with a text that said, only, call me when you can. Tonight was noticed. He had not called anyone. He had lain there and watched the ceiling and held the phone against his sternum like it was a compress against something bleeding. When it rang at 6:47 and the screen showed Jeffrey Marsh, he picked up before the second vibration. Jeffrey. Nathan. Jeffrey Marsh's voice had a specific quality that Nathan had learned to read over 9 years of working together. There was the Jeffrey who was managing something, and the Jeffrey who was managing something serious, and the Jeffrey who was genuinely alarmed and using all of his professional training to prevent that alarm from being audible. This was the third Jeffrey. I need you to come into the office this morning, early. Are you available at 8? Nathan sat up. The room moved slightly. He had drunk more than he'd tracked last night. What happened? There are some documents I need to walk you through in person. It's not a conversation for the phone. Jeffrey, tell me. A pause. A brief one, the kind that contains a decision. Ashford Crane filed a formal notice yesterday afternoon with First Meridian Capital, under Section 14C of your 2014 facility agreement, the personal guarantor clause. Nathan said nothing. Nathan, are you there? I'm here. His voice came out as something that was not quite his voice. Thinner. Walk me through it. Section 14C allows for a declaration of material change in the personal guarantor structure when the lead guarantor's domestic and financial circumstances change in a way that... Nathan, the clause was written in 2014 when the facility was originally structured. Your father-in-law's attorneys drafted it. I reviewed it at the time. We both reviewed it. There was language in there that I characterized then as boilerplate, and Another pause. I need you to sit with this carefully. I characterized it as boilerplate. It was not boilerplate. Nathan pressed his palm flat against the mattress. Hard. He needed to feel something solid. What does it trigger? At minimum, a full review of the facility's collateral structure. First Meridian will almost certainly issue a temporary hold on the credit line pending that review, which means the Series D draw. The scheduled draw was Monday. Yes. The Series D draw, $47 million scheduled for Monday morning, representing the second tranche of Vantage Group's expansion capital, the tranche that funded the Callaway acquisition, the acquisition that Nathan had announced to his board in April and to the market in a press release in May, the acquisition that every single projection for Vantage Group's next 3 years of growth was built upon. $47 million. Monday morning, and today was Saturday. Can we challenge it? Nathan said. I've been up since 3 a.m. reviewing the language. Nathan, I have to be honest with you. The clause is airtight. Her family's attorneys, whoever drafted this in 2014, drafted it to be airtight. It was airtight when I read it, and I did not understand what I was reading. What does that mean for the acquisition? Jeffrey Marsh was quiet for a moment. It means we have approximately 36 hours to find alternative collateral or alternative financing before First Meridian is obligated to formally suspend the facility. And if the facility is suspended and the draw doesn't execute on Monday, Callaway's agreement has a breach clause that, I know what Callaway's breach clause says. He had written Callaway's breach clause. He had sat in a conference room 8 months ago and negotiated every line of that agreement, and he had been proud of it, had considered it a mark of his deal-making instincts, had told 2 people afterward that it was the tightest acquisition agreement he'd constructed in 15 years. 8 o'clock, Nathan said. I'll be there. He ended the call and sat at the edge of the bed with his feet on the floor and his phone in his hand, and he breathed. He breathed the way you breathe when the ground has given way and you are in the process of falling, and some part of your brain is still insisting, against all physical evidence, that you can catch yourself. 47 million. Monday morning, 36 hours. He called Sienna. She picked up on the first ring. She had clearly also not slept. Her voice had that scoured, overheated quality of someone who had been awake all night running a conversation they weren't having out loud. Nathan, I've been... The credit line, he said. Did you know? What? Did you know about the clause, Section 14C? Did Evelyn ever mention it? Did you ever hear, Nathan, I don't know what you're talking about. What happened with the credit line? He told her. He told her in the clipped, structural way he delivered information when he needed to hear it ordered, when saying it out loud was partly a mechanism for making it real. When he finished, there was silence on her end that had a specific texture to it, not the silence of someone processing information, but the silence of someone whose internal calculation had just shifted in a significant way. Sienna, I'm here. Say something. I'm thinking. Think out loud. Another silence. Then, how bad is it if the draw doesn't execute? The acquisition falls. The acquisition falls. We're in breach. Callaway's attorneys pursue the penalty clause, which is $22 million. Our board has a material misrepresentation issue because I told them in April that the facility was secured, and every institutional relationship that was built on the expectation of this acquisition growing the company to the valuation I projected. He stopped. He ran his hand over his face. The stubble on his jaw was a day and a half old, and it scraped against his palm with a sound like something tearing. It unravels. It unravels back to the beginning. Sienna said, What about your personal assets? He heard it. The question was shaped like concern and was not concern. It was something more specific than concern. It was assessment. It was a particular kind of arithmetic, and he heard it in the back of his head like a frequency he hadn't known he could perceive until now. They're leveraged, he said, against the facility. Another silence, longer. Sienna. I'm here, Nathan. Come to Jeffrey's office, 8 o'clock. I can't, she said. And the 2 words arrived with a completeness to them that told him, before she said anything else, what the shape of the next few minutes was going to be. I have the Meridian Foundation Board meeting this morning, the quarterly review. Cancel it. I can't cancel it. Nathan, if I cancel it the morning after last night, after what I said at the gala, they're going to think, Sienna, his voice came out flat, cancel the meeting. I'll call you after. Her voice had acquired a professional coating that had not been there 10 minutes ago. He could hear her becoming someone else in real time, the way a sky changes before rain, the whole quality of it shifting into something closed and self-protective and managed. Let me know what Jeffrey says. She ended the call. Nathan sat with the dead phone in his hand for a long time. He thought about 14 months. He thought about specific evenings and specific conversations and specific moments when Sienna had said things that had mattered to him, had seemed to matter, had felt like they mattered, The way everything that you later understand was a performance feels indistinguishable from truth while it's happening. He sat with the phone in his hand, and he felt something that had been living in his chest for the last 12 hours begin, slowly, to calcify into something hard and cold and done. He put the phone down. He stood up. He went to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror the way you look at a face that you're trying to get information from and are not getting the information you need. He turned on the cold tap and bent and put water on his face, the shock of it pulling him into his body, into the physical present, away from the circular arithmetic of the last 12 hours. He straightened. He looked at himself again. Then he put on his jacket and went to find his wife. The Ashford family house, Graham and Constance's, the one in the West Hill district that Nathan had been to 100 times over 14 years, was a 40-minute drive in morning traffic. Nathan made it in 32. He didn't call ahead. He understood that calling ahead was a version of asking permission, and he was not in a position, psychologically, to ask permission for anything right now. The house was set back from the street behind a low stone wall and an iron gate that was, at 7:40 on a Saturday morning, standing open. Nathan pulled through it and parked on the gravel drive and sat in the car for 30 seconds, looking at the house's front face. Limestone, 3 stories, the proportions of a different era, the kind of house that had been built when building something this size was a statement about permanence rather than wealth. And then he got out and rang the bell. Constance Ashford opened the door herself. She was in day clothes, composed, her coffee cup in hand, and she looked at Nathan Cole on her front step with an expression that contained everything and communicated nothing. "Nathan," she said, "is Evelyn here?" "She's having breakfast." "I need to talk to her." Constance held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and opened it wider and said, "Come in, then." She led him through the main hall. The house smelled the way it always smelled, old wood and cut flowers and the ghost of something baked, and into the kitchen, which was the room Nathan had always found most disorienting about this house, because it was the one room that felt actually lived in, that felt like a place where people ate and argued and existed without performing anything. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a section of the morning paper folded to a specific article and a plate with half a piece of toast on it. She looked up when he came through the door. She did not look surprised. Of course she didn't. "Nathan," she said. Not a greeting exactly. Just the word, used as a marker, the way you mark a place on a page. "You filed yesterday afternoon," he said. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He had not been invited to sit, and he did not sit. 4:47. "Yes." "You planned it for yesterday, for during the gala." "I planned the filing for Friday," she said. "The gala was the same Friday. That was a coincidence." "Was it?" She looked at him steadily. "The attorneys had a window on Friday afternoon. I took it. The timing relative to the gala was not the point." "What was the point?" She set down her coffee. She looked at him with an expression that he could not fully decode. Not cold, not satisfied, not cruel, not the face of a woman taking revenge. It was more tired than any of those things, and more certain. "The point was to protect myself," she said. 14 months ago, you started making decisions that put my financial and personal security at risk without my knowledge. The filing is how I stopped that. The acquisition is your problem to solve." He stepped into the room. Constance was somewhere behind him. He heard her coffee cup being set on a counter, felt her presence in the peripheral space of the kitchen, watchful and still. "Evelyn, the draw is Monday. If First Meridian freezes the facility before Monday, I know when the draw is, then you know what happens if it doesn't execute." "Yes." The word was so simple and so complete that it stopped him. He stood in the middle of his former in-law's kitchen and looked at the woman he had been married to for 14 years and tried to find the angle, the opening, the version of this conversation that produced a different outcome. He was a deal maker. He had been finding angles in rooms his whole career. There was always an angle. There was always a piece of leverage, a relationship, a mutual interest that could be identified and applied. He looked at Evelyn's face and understood for the first time completely that there was no angle in this room. "What would it take?" he said, not proud, not performing, stripped of everything that didn't matter. "Tell me what it would take." "Nathan, Name it, whatever it is. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock counted 3 seconds. She said, "There is nothing it would take. This isn't a negotiation. Everything is a negotiation." "Not this." She said it without heat. "You made a series of choices. Those choices have consequences. I spent 4 months making sure that the consequences were proportional and legal, and that nothing I did constituted harm beyond what was necessary to protect myself. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm not interested in that. But I'm not going to help you, and I'm not going to ask my family to reverse what they've done, and I'm not going to—" She stopped. She looked at her toast. She looked back at him. "I'm not going to keep being the infrastructure for a life I'm no longer part of." The word infrastructure landed in him like something thrown, because it was his word. She was using his word, the word he'd used in the corridor last night without knowing where she'd gotten it, and he understood now that she'd heard him, had metabolized it, had filed it, and returned it to him with surgical precision. "The Callaway breach penalty," he said. His voice had gone somewhere quiet and distant. 22 million. "I know. My board is going to launch an investigation. Material misrepresentation. Probably. Evelyn." He said her name and nothing else. He said it the way you say a word when the word is all you have left. She looked at him. He saw something in her face that was not satisfaction and not cruelty, and was not what he'd expected. It looked, more than anything, like exhaustion. Like a person who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had set it down and was now feeling the strange emptiness of hands that had been full. "Go talk to Jeffrey," she said. "And then go talk to your board. And be honest with them, Nathan. Be honest for once about what you built and how you built it and what it actually needs to stand on. That's the only advice I have." He stood there for 3 more seconds. He could hear himself breathing. He could hear the kitchen clock. He could hear, somewhere in the house above them, a floorboard creak under someone's weight. Graham Ashford moving through his own house on a Saturday morning, unhurried, certain, in possession of a patience that Nathan had spent 14 years misreading as warmth. He turned and walked out. He sat in his car in the gravel drive for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then he started it and pulled out through the open gate and drove. The call from Douglas Fenwick came at 8:53, 20 minutes into the meeting with Jeffrey Marsh. Nathan stepped out of the conference room to take it and stood in the corridor outside Jeffrey's office with the phone to his ear and listened to Douglas Fenwick's voice. Careful, professional, deeply impersonal. Communicate that Stellarfield Capital was formally requesting a postponement of all active discussions with Vantage Group pending a review of the company's financing structure. Douglas used precise language. He did not say withdrawal. He did not say concern. He said postponement and review and due diligence protocols, and none of those words meant anything other than what they meant, which was that he was gone. Nathan thanked him and ended the call and stood in the corridor looking at the window at the end of it, which gave onto a view of the city's financial district in the flat morning light, the buildings standing in their usual arrangement, the whole geometry of it unchanged. He thought about something Evelyn had said 4 months ago, before any of this, before he'd understood that anything was happening. They had been at dinner, a Thursday, ordinary, the kind of evening that exists in a marriage as connective tissue rather than event. And she had said something about the nature of trust that he had not really listened to at the time, had filed as a fragment of conversation while his mind was elsewhere. She had said, "The problem with borrowed foundations is that you don't know they're borrowed until the person who lent them stops." He had said, "What are you talking about?" She had looked at him across the dinner table with a small smile and said, "Nothing, never mind." He went back into the conference room. Jeffrey Marsh was on his own phone. When he saw Nathan's face, he ended his call and set the phone down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man preparing to deliver information that he has been trying to find a better way to deliver and has accepted there is no better way. "Fenwick," Nathan said. "I heard." Jeffrey had been Nathan's attorney long enough to read the specific quality of his silences. He folded his hands on the table. "Sit down, Nathan. Tell me where we are." "Sit down." Nathan sat. Jeffrey opened the folder in front of him and turned it so Nathan could see the top document, a 1-page summary prepared by Jeffrey's team overnight, The kind of document that delivered complex information in plain language, the kind prepared specifically for moments when the person receiving the information needed to understand it without having to work for it. Nathan looked at the summary. He read it once. He read it again. Line 7. A clause he had not thought about in 11 years, buried in a document he had signed when he was 33 years old, and building something from the ground up, and grateful beyond description for the family his new wife came from and the resources they were making available to him. A clause his own attorney had reviewed and characterized as boilerplate. A clause written by Graham Ashford's attorneys with a patience and a foresight that Nathan was only now, 11 years later, in a position to fully appreciate. The clause did not just affect the credit facility. It affected the personal guarantee structure underlying every major financing instrument Vantage Group had constructed in the last decade. Every one of them had, threaded through it, a dependency on the Ashford-Crane relationship, not obvious, not front-facing, but load-bearing in the way that certain structural elements are load-bearing without being visible until someone removes them. He had built a tower. He had been so proud of the tower. He had stood in front of boards and investors and the city's financial press and described the tower with the language of a man who had built something with his own hands. He had not known that the foundation belonged to someone else. He looked up from the document. Jeffrey Marsh was watching him with the expression of a man who has delivered a verdict and is now simply present while the verdict is absorbed. Nathan said, very quietly, "How did I not know this?" Jeffrey said nothing, because there was no answer to that question that Jeffrey could give him that wasn't also partly an indictment of Jeffrey himself, and they both understood this without it needing to be said. Nathan sat with the document in front of him and felt something happening to his understanding of the last 14 years. Not just the last 14 months, not just the affair and the gala and the corridor and Sienna's voice going professional on a Saturday morning, but all of it, the entire construction of his adult life, the thing he had believed himself to be and to have built, shifting on its axis and revealing from a new angle a shape he had not previously been able to see. He had thought he was the architect. He had been the building. His phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen. A text from Marcus. Board chair is calling an emergency session. Monday, 7 a.m. You need to be there. He set the phone face down. He looked at Jeffrey Marsh, and then, from somewhere under the rubble of the morning, something else began to surface in Nathan Cole. Not hope, not yet, and not the specific desperate energy of a man reaching for angles. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. The particular quality of attention that arrives in a person when everything they thought they were has been stripped away, and what remains is simply the person, without the architecture, standing in a room that no longer belongs to them, deciding what comes next. "Tell me," he said to Jeffrey, "exactly what I actually own." Jeffrey looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to page 3 of the folder and began. Jeffrey turned to page 3 and began to read. Nathan listened with his hands flat on the conference table and his eyes fixed on the middle distance above the folder, and his breathing deliberate and shallow, the kind of breathing you do when you are trying to keep your body from registering what your mind is processing. Jeffrey's voice was even and precise, and he read each line without editorializing because he understood that Nathan did not need editorial right now, needed only the plain architecture of the thing, needed to know what the structure actually was before he could begin to think about what came next. What Nathan actually owned, stripped of the Ashford infrastructure, stripped of the facility and the personal guarantee structures and the relationships that had been built on the back of a family name, he had spent 14 years treating as an extension of himself. The original Vantage Group operating entity, incorporated in 2009, pre-Ashford, pre-Evelyn, built on 3 client relationships and a line of credit from a regional bank that no longer existed under that name. A minority share, 31%, in a mid-market logistics consultancy that had been acquired 4 years ago and had underperformed its projections by a margin that Nathan had been managing the optics of for 18 months. A personal real estate holding in his name only, the Meridian District House, mortgaged at 68% of its current assessed value. And a reputation, 14 years of deal history, a name that still meant something in certain rooms, though the size of those rooms was, as of this morning, contracting. Jeffrey finished reading. He closed the folder. Nathan said, The house is in my name only. Yes. Evelyn's attorneys were very specific about what they did and didn't include in the restructuring. The house is yours. She didn't take the house. No. Nathan thought about this. He filed it somewhere and moved on. The board meeting Monday morning. What's the exposure on the misrepresentation question? Jeffrey leaned back slightly. The April board presentation characterized the Series D facility as secured. The technical argument is that it was secured at the time. The clause wasn't triggered until yesterday's filing. Whether the board accepts that framing depends heavily on the relationship dynamics in the room. Some of those directors, Whitmore is going to push for my removal. Whitmore had concerns before last night. You know that. He was managed. He was managed through relationships that are currently under review. Jeffrey said it carefully, the language of a man who had learned to be precise in rooms where precision was the only form of protection available. I would not count on Whitmore being manageable on Monday. Nathan stood up. He could not sit anymore. He walked to the window. Jeffrey's office was on the 22nd floor, a different view of the same city he'd looked at from the hotel window at 4 a.m, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders tight, and he thought. He thought about $47 million and Monday morning and $22 million in breach penalties and a board chair who had been building a case for 6 months. He thought about Fenwick's voice on the phone, careful, impersonal, postponement, review, due diligence protocols, and the specific sound of a door closing behind language designed not to sound like a door closing. He thought about Sienna Vale saying, "I'll call you after," in the voice of someone who had decided something without announcing the decision. He turned around. "I need 48 hours, he said. Jeffrey looked at him. "Not for the facility. That's done. I understand that's done. I need 48 hours for the board. I need to get in front of the story before Whitmore does. I need to call every director individually before Monday morning and give them the version of this that has a path forward, because if I walk into that room on Monday and they've spent the weekend talking to each other without hearing from me, Nathan, I know what I'm asking." He moved back to the table. He was in the room now in a different way than he'd been in it an hour ago. The quality of his attention had changed, had sharpened into something that had no room for anything that wasn't immediately operational. "Get me the personal contact for every board member, not the office lines. Personal. And I need whatever you have on the Callaway breach clause, specifically whether the $22 million is the ceiling or the floor." Jeffrey watched him. "It's the floor." "Then I need to know the ceiling." Jeffrey opened his mouth to say something and then closed it. And what closed it was the look on Nathan Cole's face. Not desperation, which was what Jeffrey had been bracing for since 7 o'clock this morning, but something older and less manageable than desperation. Something that lived below panic and below strategy and below the 14 years of performance and positioning and careful management of other people's perception of him. Something that looked, Jeffrey thought, like the man Nathan Cole had been before any of this existed, before Evelyn, before the Ashfords, before the tower. "All right," Jeffrey said. He reached for his own phone. "Give me 20 minutes. Nathan Cole spent the next 11 hours on the phone. He called directors. He called institutional contacts. He called 2 men he had not spoken to in 6 years who owed him, in ways that had never been formally acknowledged, significant professional debts that had matured in the intervening time into something he could now carefully present as an invitation rather than a demand. He called Marcus, his assistant, and gave him a list of tasks and a timeline and told him to clear everything for the next 72 hours. He ate nothing between noon and 7 p.m. He drank 4 cups of coffee and 2 glasses of water and was aware distantly of his body operating on reserves it was not designed to run on indefinitely. He did not call Sienna. She texted at 1:14. "How did the meeting go?" He read it. He set the phone down. He picked up the other line and kept working. At 7:40 that evening, he drove to the Meridian District House. His house, as of this morning. He let himself in and stood in the front hall and looked at the space. Evelyn had taken almost nothing. There were gaps, places where things had been that now weren't. Small, negative spaces that told the story of a person methodically and without drama removing themselves from a physical environment over a period of time. A particular lamp from the study. The photographs on the hall table replaced by a single ceramic bowl that had always been hers. Small things. Specific things. Nothing theatrical. He walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stood looking at it for a long time before closing it without taking anything and sitting down at the kitchen table and putting his head in his hands. He sat like that for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he was watching the clock on the stove from between his fingers. Then he lifted his head and took out his phone and called Sienna. It rang 4 times. She picked up on the 5th. Her voice was careful. That coding again, the one he'd heard at 7 in the morning, the professional layer applied over whatever was actually there. "Nathan, I need to know something," he said. "Okay." "The Meridian Foundation board meeting this morning, the quarterly review." "Yes." "They asked you about last night." A pause. "It came up. What did you tell them?" "I told them that my personal life was separate from my professional responsibilities." He pressed 2 fingers against his eye socket. The pressure helped minutely with the headache that had been building behind his right eye since noon. "Sienna, did they ask you to step back from your executive role?" A longer pause. The length of it was its own answer. "It's temporary," she said. "A leave of absence pending. They asked you to step back." "It's standard. It's a governance protocol, Nathan. It doesn't mean—" "Stop." He said it flat and without anger, which was more effective than anger because she heard in it that he had moved past the register where anger was available. "Don't manage me. Not right now. I don't have the capacity for managed information right now." Silence. "Were you using the Foundation's donor access," he said, "to run interference for things we were doing at Vantage?" The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. It was the silence of someone who has been asked, for the first time, the question that had always been in the room. "That's a complicated question," Sienna said. "It's a yes or no question." "Nathan, the relationships between philanthropic networks and corporate—" "Sienna." His voice went somewhere very quiet. "Yes or no?" She said, "I made introductions. I facilitated conversations. Everything I did was within—" "Did Evelyn's attorneys subpoena your Foundation communications?" The silence now was absolute. It lasted 4 seconds, and it contained, in those 4 seconds, the answer to every question he had not known to ask over the previous 14 months. "When?" he said. "I don't— When did you receive the subpoena?" 3 weeks ago." Her voice had shed the coating now. What was underneath it was something smaller and more frightened than what she had been performing for the last 14 months. "Nathan, I was going to tell you. I was trying to find the right— 3 weeks." He stood up from the kitchen table. He walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the evening was doing its ordinary thing. Neighbors, streetlight, the sound of a car passing. "You received a legal subpoena 3 weeks ago in a matter directly connected to my marriage and my company, and you didn't tell me. I needed to talk to my own attorney first, and then the gala was coming, and I thought—" She stopped. He heard her breath. "I thought after last night, after I made it public, it would be different. I thought once it was out in the open—" "You thought once it was out in the open," Nathan said slowly, "that I would be committed, that I couldn't go back." She didn't answer. "That's what last night was," he said. "That's what the microphone was. You weren't declaring something, you were removing my exit." "That's not—" "Don't." The word came out like a door slamming. "Don't tell me what it was. I know what it was. I'm standing in my kitchen the morning after my credit line was frozen, and my acquisition is about to collapse, and my board is going to vote on my removal on Monday morning, and I'm looking at the sequence of things that happened, and I'm seeing, for the first time, the sequence clearly." He pressed his hand flat against the kitchen counter. The cold of the granite came through his palm. "You knew about the subpoena. You knew Evelyn's attorneys were building something, and instead of telling me, you accelerated. You made it public so that I'd be standing exactly where I'm standing right now, with no line of retreat and no option to negotiate, because that was the only version of this where I ended up fully committed to you." Sienna said nothing. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. She didn't. He ended the call. He stood at the kitchen counter in his own house with his hand on the cold granite and breathed. The headache behind his right eye had expanded to include most of his skull. His stomach was empty and tight. His shirt was still the one he'd put on yesterday morning, 36 hours ago, before the gala, before the corridor, before any of this morning, and it felt like wearing evidence. He thought about Evelyn in her parents' kitchen, calm, certain, toast on a plate, the morning paper folded to a specific article, looking at him with an expression that was not cruel and not satisfied, and not the face of a woman taking revenge. He thought about what she'd said. Be honest, Nathan. Be honest for once about what you built and how you built it and what it actually needs to stand on. He had spent the day doing everything except that. He had spent the day working angles, making calls, building the version of the story that gave him a path forward, running the machinery of his professional identity at full capacity in the service of preserving the structure of a life that had just had its entire foundation removed. He had done it with skill and speed and the genuine competence of a man who knew how to fight in the arena he'd built his career in. And none of it, he understood now in the kitchen with the cold granite under his palm, was going to be enough. The board meeting was Monday at 7 a.m., 24 calls made today. 3 directors who had listened carefully and said little. 2 who had been warm but non-committal in the specific way of people preparing to vote against you. Whitmore, who had not picked up and had not returned the message, which was itself a form of communication. The breach penalty from Callaway, which Jeffrey had now confirmed was uncapped, which meant whatever Callaway's attorneys decided to characterize as consequential damages, which meant a number that could be whatever the opposing counsel was willing to argue in front of a judge. And Sienna Vale's Foundation communications, subpoenaed 3 weeks ago, sitting in Evelyn's attorney's possession, containing. He did not know what they contained. He did not know the specifics. He knew Sienna had used donor access to facilitate things. He had known this at some level and had not examined it because examining it meant asking questions whose answers he did not want to have. He was going to want to have them now. He straightened. He called Jeffrey Marsh for the 3rd time that day. Jeffrey picked up on the 2nd ring, which told Nathan that Jeffrey had been expecting this call. The subpoena on Vale's communications, Nathan said. What's the scope? Jeffrey was quiet for half a beat. Where did you hear about that? Sienna. Ah, the single syllable of a man recalibrating. Nathan, those communications are in discovery for the civil proceedings, not for Jeffrey. What's in them? Another pause. Jeffrey Marsh had been Nathan's attorney for 9 years. He had, Nathan understood now, also been the attorney who'd reviewed and cleared the 2014 facility agreement containing Section 14C. He had been, Nathan was beginning to understand, sitting at the center of a web of relationships whose geometry Nathan had never fully mapped, because mapping it had never seemed necessary. There are communications, Jeffrey said carefully, between Ms. Vale and several foundation donors that reference, in general terms, the positioning of certain Vantage Group initiatives in ways that may have what? That may have benefited from information about foundation donor intentions that would not ordinarily have been available to a corporate entity operating at arm's length. Nathan turned this over. He turned it over in the specific way of a man who had been in enough legal situations to understand what the sentence meant under the sentence. She was tipping me. The communications suggest she was using the Foundation's donor intelligence to tip Vantage Group's positioning on key deals, and Evelyn's attorneys have those communications. Nathan, did you know? The quality of Jeffrey Marsh's silence was, in that moment, the most complete answer Nathan had received all day. He said, Jeffrey, did you know? I was aware that there were aspects of Ms. Vale's professional conduct that could become relevant in a contested divorce proceeding. I counseled you 3 months ago to consider a more structured approach to. You counseled me to consider. Nathan's voice had gone somewhere cold and very quiet. You told me 3 months ago in this exact office that I should think about restructuring some of my professional communications. You said it was routine maintenance. You said it in a meeting that lasted 12 minutes. Nathan, you knew there was a problem with Sienna's conduct, and you said 12 words about it, and you didn't tell me what you were actually talking about. Jeffrey said nothing. Nathan looked at the window of his kitchen. He looked at the street outside, the ordinary evening, the people who did not know and did not care what was happening in this house on this night, the vast indifference of the world to any individual's precise moment of reckoning. He said, "Get me everything. Every document, every communication, every piece of paper that exists in the discovery file that my wife's attorneys have seen. I want to see it tonight. Nathan, those are protected. I want to see everything that exists in my own legal situation that I have not yet been shown. Tonight, Jeffrey. I'll be at your office in 40 minutes. He ended the call. He went upstairs. He showered for 4 minutes, cold, then hot, then cold again, and changed into clean clothes and stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at his own face. The face was older than it had been yesterday. Not visibly, not in any way that a photograph would capture, but he could feel it in the skin around his eyes, and in the quality of the line of his jaw, and in the way his own gaze, when he met it in the mirror, was different from the gaze of the man who had stood at a wet bar in a hotel suite 24 hours ago and told his wife she looked fine. He dried his face. He went downstairs, he picked up his keys, his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. A text from an unknown number he did not recognize, 11 digits, no name. He opened it. The text contained a single attachment, a screenshot. He expanded it and looked at it for a long time. It was an email, sent 8 months ago, from Sienna Vale's foundation account to an address Nathan didn't recognize. A personal Gmail account, no name attached. The email was 7 lines long. It described, in language that was attempting to be oblique and was not quite oblique enough, the precise structure of Vantage Group's interest in a specific municipal infrastructure contract, a contract that had not yet been announced publicly at the time the email was sent. The email described the contract's terms, the likely award timeline, and the names of 2 city officials who were, according to the email, already aligned. Below the screenshot, in the text message itself, a single line. There are 41 more. Evelyn has them all. So does the DA's office. Nathan read the last sentence twice. The DA's office. This was no longer a divorce proceeding. This was no longer a credit line and a board vote and a breach penalty. This was something that occupied an entirely different category of problem, a category that had different floors and different ceilings and different vocabulary and different stakes, and Nathan Cole stood in his kitchen with his phone in his hand and felt the full weight of it settle onto him with the specific gravity of something that could not be argued with, could not be angled around, could not be managed through a series of carefully placed phone calls to people who owed him professional debts. He looked at the unknown number. He typed, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. The response came back in 4 seconds. Someone who thought you deserved to know before Monday. You have 1 night to decide what you're going to do with it. After that, the decision gets made for... He stood in the kitchen for a long time after the message cut off mid-sentence. After that, the decision gets made for you. He knew how the sentence ended. He didn't need to see it. He stood with the phone in his hand and felt the specific weight of a night that had no good options in it, only a hierarchy of costs. And he thought about what it meant that someone had sent him this, that someone with access to 41 emails and knowledge of a DA investigation had chosen, on a Sunday night with 14 hours before a board meeting, to put this in his hands. Someone thought he deserved to know, or someone thought they could control what he did with knowing. He set the phone on the counter. He looked at it. He picked it up again and forwarded the screenshot to Jeffrey Marsh with a single line. "Call me in 20 minutes. Don't text. Call." Then he sat down at the kitchen table in the house that was now his alone, and he thought about the decision with the kind of clarity that only arrives when every other option has been removed. He could do nothing. Walk into the board meeting Monday morning and fight for his position and let whatever the DA's office had move at whatever pace it moved. He could lawyer up. More lawyers, better lawyers. The kind of lawyers that cost what small buildings cost. And construct a defense around the argument that he had not known the specifics of how Sienna had used foundation access, which was true in the precise legal sense and catastrophically false in every human sense. He could run. This option arrived in his mind briefly and with genuine force, and he sat with it for exactly the time it deserved, which was about 8 seconds, and then he let it go. Or he could call Evelyn. Jeffrey called at 11:40. Nathan answered and said, before Jeffrey could speak, "I need to know if Evelyn's attorneys are the source of that text." "They're not," Jeffrey said. He sounded like a man who had been on his own phone for the last 20 minutes. and had not liked what he'd heard. I made 2 calls. The communication came from inside Sienna Vale's former foundation network, someone on the donor side. I don't know more than that yet. The DA? How serious? Jeffrey exhaled. It was the exhale of a man choosing between several versions of an answer and selecting the most honest one. Serious. The communication suggests potential misuse of nonprofit donor intelligence for private commercial gain. There's a securities angle depending on how aggressively they characterize the municipal contract information. Nathan, this is not something that resolves in a board meeting. This is something that resolves in a federal courthouse or in a cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office. Cooperation against Sienna. Cooperation against whatever they're actually building. I don't know the full scope yet. I won't know until Monday. I can't wait until Monday. Nathan, I need to see Evelyn tonight. A long pause. That is almost certainly not advisable from a... I'm not asking for legal advice, Nathan said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. If there are documents in her attorney's possession that are also in the DA's possession, then there is a version of Monday morning that I have no control over and a version that I might have partial control over. And the difference between those 2 versions is whether I walk into a room having already been honest or whether I wait and get forced into honesty by a process that won't care about the difference. Jeffrey was quiet. She told me this morning, Nathan said. Be honest. She said it like she knew I wouldn't, and she was right. I spent the entire day doing everything except that. Jeffrey said, What are you expecting from her? Nothing, Nathan said, and meant it. I'm not expecting anything. I need to tell her about the 41 emails. I need to tell her that whatever her attorneys have, there may be more, and it may have dimensions that go beyond her divorce proceedings, and she deserves to know that from me rather than from a deposition. He ended the call. He picked up his car keys. He drove. It was past midnight when he pulled up outside the apartment building on Carver Street. Evelyn had rented it 3 months ago, quietly, as part of the same methodical process by which she had restructured her assets and repositioned her life. And Nathan knew the address because it was in the disclosure documents his own attorney had provided. He had never been there. He sat outside it for a moment looking at the lit window on the 4th floor and thought about whether this was the right thing or just the only thing, and concluded that at this point the distinction had ceased to matter. He called her cell. It rang 3 times. She picked up. She said his name the way she'd said it that morning. A marker, not a greeting. I'm outside, he said. I know it's late. I need 20 minutes. A silence. He could hear her breathing and the specific quality of someone deciding something. Then, buzzer code is 4712. He went up. She opened the apartment door in a gray sweatshirt and bare feet and her hair down, and it was the most informal he had seen her in weeks, and it hit him somewhere undefended. The apartment was small and spare and exactly what he would have expected. Functional, a few good pieces of furniture, the ceramic bowl from the hall table on the kitchen counter, 3 books stacked on the coffee table with their spines facing out. She had made it her own in the specific economical way of a person who knows how to be at home inside themselves rather than inside a space. She stood back from the door and let him in. He came in. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the bowl on the counter and then looked at her. There's a DA investigation, he said. Into Sienna. Into communications she sent from her foundation account. 41 emails that your attorneys have in discovery and that the DA's office also has. He watched her face. I found out tonight. Someone in the donor network sent me a screenshot. She looked at him steadily. I know about the investigation. He had expected this. He nodded. How long? I referred the communications to the DA's office 6 weeks ago. My attorneys identified them during discovery, and we had a legal obligation to put that's 6 weeks. Yes. He put his hand through his hair, stood there. You've known for 6 weeks that this was going to become a criminal matter. I've known for 6 weeks that it might. I wasn't certain. I'm still not certain what the DA intends to do with it. They're going to use it, Nathan said. Whatever they build, they're going to need context on the commercial side, on Vantage Group's positioning on the municipal contracts. They're going to need someone who can speak to whether those deals were influenced by information that shouldn't have been available to us. Evelyn said nothing. They're going to come to me, Nathan said. That's what tonight is. That's why someone sent me that text. To make sure I understood what was coming before Monday so I could decide what position to take before the position got decided for me. She moved to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water and brought them back and set one on the coffee table in front of where he was standing. She sat on the edge of the couch with her glass and looked at him. "Sit down, Nathan." He sat. The couch was different from the one in the Meridian house, smaller, firmer. He sat on the edge of it the way he'd sat on the hotel linen cart 2 nights ago, perched at the limit of a surface, not resting. "I didn't know," he said, "about the specifics, the municipal contract information. I knew Sienna understood the landscape. I knew she had access to relationships and conversations that were useful to how we positioned certain things. But I did not know she was forwarding specific intelligence and specific language to a specific account. I want you to know that." Evelyn looked at her water glass. She turned it in her hands once, slowly. "I believe you," she said. The simplicity of it, the absence of qualification, the matter-of-fact way it arrived, it was more than he'd expected, and it undid something in him that he had not known was still wound tight. He pressed his hands together and looked at the floor. "What do I do?" he said. Not to her as his wife, not as a man asking a woman to save him, as a person asking another person who was smarter than him about a thing he didn't fully understand. She was quiet for a moment. "You go to the DA's office before they come to you. You tell them everything you know and everything you don't know, and you let that difference be visible. You don't construct a version. You don't manage the narrative." She looked at him directly. "You tell them the truth, and you let it be as ugly as it is, and you trust that the difference between someone who knew and someone who benefited without knowing is a difference that matters legally." And the board. Tell them the same thing. Monday morning, before Whitmore opens his mouth, you tell them the truth. She paused. "Not the angle, Nathan. Not the version that gives you the best position. The actual truth. About the facility, about Section 14C, about what you understood and what you didn't about Sienna. All of it. They'll remove me. They might. The company will survive, or it won't, based on what it actually is without the parts that shouldn't have been there." She said it without cruelty, without satisfaction, with the clean, unflinching directness of a woman who had been accurate about things for a very long time and had stopped softening accuracy for the benefit of the people receiving it. "That's not a punishment. That's just what's true." He looked at her. He looked at the apartment around her, sparse and considered and organized around what was actually necessary and nothing else. He thought about what she had been doing for the past 4 months while he had been entirely unaware of it, the quiet industry of it, the patience, the precision. He thought about the version of her that had existed as ambient infrastructure in his life for so long that he had ceased to see it as anything other than a feature of the landscape. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." She waited. "Did you plan all of it?" he said. "The gala, the filing, the sequence? Did you plan it from the beginning as a single coordinated thing, or did it unfold as you went?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Does the answer change anything for you?" "No, I just want to know." She said, "I planned the legal structure completely. That was done by March. The gala. Sienna chose the gala herself. I didn't orchestrate that. When I found out she was planning something that night, I made the decision to stop preventing it. There's a difference." She set her water glass down. "I didn't set her up. She chose the stage herself. I just made sure I was ready when she did." He took this in. He turned it over. He found somewhere in the turning something that felt almost like the ghost of a thing he recognized as respect. "You're going to be all right," he said. "You were always going to be all right." "Yes," she said simply. "I made a mistake not seeing that sooner, not seeing what you actually were." She looked at him with the expression she'd worn in the corridor at the gala and in her parents' kitchen, and now here, not cold, not the face of someone who had won something, the tired, certain face of a person who had moved past the point where any of the old language applied. You saw it, she said. You just decided you didn't need to keep earning it. He had no answer for that. It was too accurate. He stood. He picked up the water glass and drank the rest of it because his throat was dry, and he was exhausted, and it was nearly 1 in the morning, and he had a long day ahead of him that he was not going to be able to manage by working angles. He set the glass down on the coffee table. The divorce, he said. My attorneys will be in contact with yours this week. It will be straightforward. I won't contest it. I know. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the door frame and turned back one last time. She was still on the couch, bare feet on the floor, her gray sweatshirt and her hair down and the 3 books on the coffee table with their spines facing out. And she looked entirely herself, entirely at home, entirely without any of the damage that this should have left visible. He did not understand how she had managed this. He thought he probably never would. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. I'm going to be honest on Monday. She held his gaze. Good, she said. That was all. He walked out. She sat in the apartment after the door closed and listened to the sound of the building returning to its nighttime quiet, the elevator, distant, descending, and she looked at her hands in her lap and breathed. She was tired in the specific way of a person at the end of something very long, not the tired of exhaustion, but the tired of completion, of a sustained effort finally discharged. She sat with it. She let it be present without trying to name it as any particular emotion. After a while, she picked up the water glass he'd left on the coffee table and carried it to the kitchen and washed it and dried it and put it away. Nathan Cole walked into the DA's office at 8:15 Monday morning. He went alone. He had called Jeffrey the night before and told him his plan, and Jeffrey had advised against it in the careful language of a man who understood it was the right thing to do and was constitutionally required to advise against it anyway. Nathan thanked him and went alone. He was there for 4 hours. He told them everything he knew in the order he knew it, and everything he didn't know in the order he didn't know it, and the difference between the 2 categories was visible and consistent, and he did not attempt to manage it. An assistant DA named Rourke asked him questions for 2 hours, and Nathan answered them without looking for the angled response, without calculating the impression he was making, without any of the machinery of impression management that had been running continuously for 14 years. It was one of the most uncomfortable things he had ever done, and also, in a way he could not have predicted, one of the most structural, as though telling the truth at the exact scale it existed, without compression, without editing, produced something in him that had been missing for a long time without him knowing it was gone. At the board meeting at 2 p.m., postponed from the morning to accommodate his DA meeting, which his board chair learned about 40 minutes before the meeting, and which detonated whatever agenda Whitmore had prepared like a charge laid under the ground, Nathan told the board the same things in the same order. He told them about the facility, about Section 14C, about what he had known when he'd made his April presentation, and what he had not known, and what he had, if he was honest, chosen not to examine too carefully. He told them about Sienna. He told them about the 41 emails. He told them he was not asking for their mercy. He was giving them accurate information so they could make an accurate decision. Whitmore voted for immediate removal. 3 directors voted with him. 2 abstained. The remaining 4 voted for a 90-day supervised restructuring period with outside counsel oversight and Nathan in an executive advisory capacity without operational authority. It was not a victory. It was not meant to be. It was the most honest meeting he had ever attended, and he left it feeling something he did not have a precise name for, something that sat in the chest adjacent to grief and adjacent to relief, and was ultimately distinct from both. The Callaway acquisition died on Tuesday. The breach penalty was assessed. His attorney spent the next 6 weeks in negotiation with Callaway's legal team over the characterization of damages and arrived at a number that was devastating and not fatal and contained within its dimensions the outline of something survivable if you were willing to rebuild from what actually existed rather than from what you had believed to exist. Nathan was willing. Sienna Vale resigned from the Meridian Cultural Foundation on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the gala, in a letter that her attorney released publicly and that said very little. The DA's investigation continued. The specifics of what would result from it remained, for months, Unclear in the way that legal processes remain unclear, grinding, slow, conducted behind language designed to reveal nothing until it revealed everything at once. Sienna hired 3 different attorneys over the following 2 months. She moved from the city in the 4th month to a smaller city 2 states away, and the social world that had watched her raise a champagne glass in the Harrington Grand Ballroom forgot about her in the efficient way that those worlds forget about people whose utility has expired. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in April. The proceedings were handled entirely by attorneys and produced a settlement that was clean and fair and reflected exactly what each person had actually brought to the marriage and what they were taking out of it. Nathan signed his copy in Jeffrey Marsh's conference room. He had retained Jeffrey because Jeffrey was very good at his job and had made one significant error of characterization 11 years ago and had spent the intervening months working to correct its consequences without being asked. Nathan had found he respected this. Evelyn signed her copy in her own attorney's office, across the city, at the same hour. He did not see her that day. They did not mark it together. It did not need marking. He sold the Meridian District house in May. The proceeds, after the mortgage, were modest. He found a 2-bedroom apartment in the Redfield neighborhood, smaller than anything he'd lived in since his early 30s, with windows that faced east and a kitchen with a gas stove that worked well, and a building that was populated by people who did not know his name or the shape of what it had recently meant. He unpacked his boxes over 2 evenings. He did not hire anyone to help. He put his own things on the shelves in the order that made sense to him without thinking about how it looked to anyone else. And on the second evening, he stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked at the east-facing windows in the early dark and felt something settle in him that had not been settled in a very long time. It was not happiness. It was something before happiness. The ground. Evelyn Ashford stood at the front of a room in the Castellan Club's main hall on a Tuesday in September and looked out at 240 women who had come from 17 cities and 3 countries to attend the inaugural summit of the Ashford Leadership Foundation, which she had incorporated in March and spent 6 months building with the specific, unhurried patience of a person who understood that what you build on the foundation matters more than how quickly it rises. The foundation's focus was leadership development for women in corporate and institutional environments, not mentorship in the ambient gesture toward a future sense, but the specific structural knowledge of how power actually worked in rooms, how alliances were built and maintained, how the infrastructure of influence was constructed and protected and, when necessary, withdrawn. The knowledge Evelyn had spent 20 years acquiring without being entirely conscious that she was acquiring it. The knowledge she had spent 4 months applying with deliberate and surgical precision. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces. She had spent 6 months thinking about what she wanted to say at this moment, had drafted remarks twice and abandoned them both times because they were the wrong shape, too polished, too constructed, too much like the surface of a thing rather than the thing itself. She had decided eventually to say what was true rather than what was designed, because she was finished, permanently and without ceremony, with the habit of managing the impression she made. She said, "I spent 14 years being very good at things that other people got credit for. I'm not telling you that as a grievance. I'm telling you as a fact about how power often works and how easy it is to mistake usefulness for security. They're not the same thing." She looked at the room. "What I want to build here is the ability to tell the difference, not the philosophy of it, the actual mechanics. How to know what you have, what you've built, and what belongs to you versus what you've been borrowing. Because the moment someone takes back what they lent you, everything that was built on top of it has to answer for itself." The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when the thing being said is not performance. "I know something about that," she said, from both directions. She looked at 240 faces, and she thought about the service corridor and the kitchen and the apartment on Carver Street and the DA's office and the divorce settlement and the east-facing windows of a 2-bedroom apartment where a man she had loved for 14 years was learning, slowly and without help, what he actually was when the borrowed architecture fell away. She thought about her father's nod across the Harrington ballroom, her mother's hand on her arm at the window, Daniel's voice at her shoulder telling her the parish group had noticed. She thought about standing in front of a mirror in a private suite with steady hands and earrings and a decision already made. She said, "Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need an audience and it doesn't need a moment. It gets built in the hours nobody sees, and it gets protected in the choices that are never visible until they are. She paused. And when it's taken from you, when the moment comes and what you thought you had turns out to have been conditional, the question isn't how to get it back. The question is what you build when you know, this time, exactly what you're building on and who it belongs to. She stopped. She looked at the room. She said, "So let's start there." Outside the Castellan Club's tall windows, the city went about its ordinary business in the flat September light. Indifferent, continuous, unaware of the precise shape of what had been built and broken and built again inside a series of rooms over the past 10 months. The traffic moved, the light changed, the people on the sidewalk walked where they were going without knowing any of the names involved or the sequence of events, or the cost of what had been required to arrive at this particular Tuesday in September with 240 women in a room and a woman at the front of it who had learned at considerable expense the precise difference between what she had and what she was. Those were not, it turned out, the same thing either, but she was no longer confused about which one mattered. She opened her mouth and began to speak, and this time she was not building anything for anyone else. And the ground under what she was building belonged entirely to her, and she had checked, and it was solid, and it would hold.